Hello, and welcome to our episode on the development and rise of Russia. Throughout Russian history, there are several themes that stay constant. The first is that Russia is always paranoid about being invaded. In their early history, they will be at the mercy of larger empires around them, like the Mongols and the Byzantines, and they will be afraid of invasion. The second and third kind of go together. Russia typically does not adapt to the changes in culture of the West. They will have rulers who encourage Western reform, like allowing more individual freedoms, but then it seems like the very next ruler decides to crack down and cut off ties with the West and take back previous reforms. The Russians also have little to no history of democracy in their culture, so the idea of reforming even into a limited monarchy will not be something that comes naturally to Russia, and why they will hang on to their absolute monarch into the 20th century. The Mongols began invading Russia between 1237 and 1240. The Tatars, a Turkish people who were also invading Russia at the time, became the agents and administrators for the Mongols, effectively cutting out the native Russians from many power positions. These invasions are what really marks Russia's political history. Up until this point in time, they were not considered to be a true unified kingdom, but after the Mongols bring them together, they will be. As you can see from the map, the Mongols conquered most of Eurasia, and the Russians themselves were actually a part of what was called the Golden Horde Khanate. The Mongol invasion was brutal on the Russian people. Many towns were viciously destroyed, and they lived under the tyranny of the Tatars. During this time, Russia is cut off from what's going on in the rest of the world. They will miss out on the High Middle Ages in Europe, as well as the Renaissance period. In 1480, Ivan III, or also known as Ivan the Great, will officially renounce the Mongols and create a new Russia. Without the Mongols, who knows if the fragmented Russia would have been able to band together to create a country again. The power of this new Russian nation was held by a group of people known as the boyars. The boyars were the ones that held land, and they controlled the serfs that lived on that land, much like European feudalism. But this is happening like 200 years after feudalism ends in Western Europe. The boyars were used to being in control of their regions and were reluctant to share their power with the new czar. Side note, look at the word czar. Can you guess where that's from? If you said Caesar, then you'd be correct. The Russians will call their rulers czars after the Latin word Caesar to model themselves after the Romans. Anyways, these new czars figured out that the best way to get the boyars to cooperate was to give them jobs within the government, so they still felt like they had some power. This will create an elaborate bureaucracy in Russia that didn't exist before. The early czars will also make military service mandatory for the boyars, so that it would create a sense of loyalty to the state. Ivan III, the man that officially declared an end to Mongol rule, set the tone for the early culture of Russia. They adopted many Byzantine traditions, including the idea that they were a continuation of the Romans and equally as important. They also will adopt the Eastern Orthodox faith and establish the Tsar as the head of the church, which is great for the government because you can mix church and state and basically do whatever you want. You also see the emergence of the Cossacks, which is a Turkish term that means free men. The Cossacks are basically the vassals of the Russian feudal system, and eventually they turn into a military class in Russia. The first Russian ruler to use the title of Tsar will be a man nicknamed Ivan the Terrible. We get to talk in detail about 3 major Russian rulers today, and Ivan is definitely the one that will stick in your mind. And yes, he is definitely, truly terrible. Settle in, and let's talk about why Ivan was so terrible. He assumed the throne at the age of 3, after his father died. Of course, he does not actually rule the country at this time, and boyar families will rule as regents until he is old enough to rule the country himself. These boyar families did not treat Ivan very well. They were cruel to him and tried to mess with his brain. They encouraged him to be cruel to people and animals, and after 10 years of this treatment, Ivan is a scarred individual. He is unbalanced, undisciplined, and cruel, and even slightly crazy. When he was 13, he executed his first boyar, something that was unheard of during that time. And by the time he was 17, He was married to Anastasia Romanov, a member of a very prestigious royal family. Here are some examples of how awful Ivan was. This is an account written by a boyar in Ivan's court. By the age of 13, Ivan was already a disturbed young man and an accomplished drinker. He threw dogs and cats from the Kremlin walls to watch them suffer. He roamed the streets of Moscow with a gang of young scoundrels, drinking, knocking down old people, and raping women. He often disposed of rape victims by having them hanged, strangled, buried alive, or thrown to the bears. He became an excellent horseman and was fond of hunting. Killing animals was not his only delight. Ivan also enjoyed robbing and beating up farmers. Meanwhile, he continued to devour books at an incredible pace, mainly religious and historical texts. At times, Ivan was very devout. He used to throw himself before the icons, banging his head against the floor. It resulted in a callosity of the forehead. Ivan even made a public confession of his sins in Moscow. So a callosity, in case you don't know what that is, it's basically like an indention in your head. So he hit his head so hard before the icons, like trying to atone for the things that he did, that he indented his skull. So obviously this guy, he's got some issues. So Ivan grows into a terrible adult, and one day he grows sick. He is afraid he will die, and he demands that all of the princes and boyars swear allegiance to his small son named Dmitri. Many of the boyars refused because they thought that this could be the official end to this tyrannical family's rule. Unfortunately, for those hopeful boyars, Ivan does survive. He visits a monastery to give thanks to God for his recovery, and while he's there, a terrible accident happened. His son, Dmitri, falls into a river and dies. Not long after the death of his son, his wife Anastasia died suddenly as well. This leaves Ivan into an emotional breakdown. He destroyed his palace and was also self-destructive. He believed that the boyars poisoned his wife, so he began to torture and execute boyars to find the culprit, which again is basically unheard of throughout history, killing off the nobles and ruling classes. It creates a lot of chaos within the country. You might think that Ivan's done enough terrible things to earn his title, but wait, there's more. In 1581, Ivan kills his second son. Ivan had been walking around the palace and ran into his son's wife. He thought she was dressed inappropriately, so he had her beaten up, which of course is the natural reaction to such a thing. She was pregnant at the time, and unfortunately, this encounter made her lose her baby. So, Ivan's son confronted his father about it, and Ivan struck him with his walking stick and hit him on the head and killed him. That's what the picture is on the top right corner, and that's what it's depicting. About 3 years later, Ivan dies, and his son Fyodor takes the throne. Ivan is one of those people that you hope has a really painful death that will bring a little justice to the situation, but he doesn't. He dies of a stroke while playing chess, which is very anticlimactic in my opinion. His son Fyodor does not have any children and dies without an heir, so Ivan's dynasty officially ends and a civil war breaks out. It's interesting to look at the contributions of the two Ivans, and while their personalities were very different, their lasting legacy is actually pretty similar. They both were able to increase government control over their people's daily lives. They established a permanent military for this new Russian state, and they also established a currency system. Law codes were introduced under Ivan III that were maintained later on. These law codes limited the power of the aristocracy, so that they could never overrule the king. And the laws made it difficult for peasants to leave their land, basically ensuring serfdom would continue for the next several centuries. Other contributions of the two Ivans include church reform. Ivan the Terrible made it so that it was the government's job to supervise the clergy, so this way the church was preaching only government-approved messages. Can you see why present-day censorship in Russia might not seem strange to Russian citizens? They've been experiencing this type of government control for centuries. The Ivans were also responsible for the creation of a secret police force called the Oprichniki. They were basically assembled to police and destroy any unloyal boyar elite people. They wore all black and rode black horses, so basically they looked terrifying. They had no consequences or remorse for torturing, killing, or dismembering boyars. The new rulers of Russia will be part of the Romanov family, the family Ivan the Terrible's wife Anastasia was a part of. The next Romanov ruler and his successors moved Russia more towards an autocracy. There was total enslavement of the peasants by 1649, which means that the peasant population has little to no rights. The military service demanded for boyars was relaxed a little, so not everyone was required to be in the military. One thing you start to see is that changes from here on out will be met with lots of civil unrest, especially from the Cossacks. They are afraid of losing land and position and will resist any changes. The next Russian ruler we will discuss is Peter the Great. Peter became the Tsar around the age of 10, but did not really get to use his power until 1689 when he was 17. Peter grew up outside of the capital of Moscow in a suburban area called the German Quarter. It was named this, as you can probably guess, because it had a lot of German and other Western immigrants living there. It was there that Peter was introduced to Western culture and more specifically to Western technology. After he started ruling officially as the Tsar, he took a trip to the West to see what Russia was missing out on. He traveled in secret. He didn't want people to know he was a king and treat him differently, and also was for safety reasons. He even worked in a shipyard in the Netherlands to gain practical experience in naval technology, something the Russians had little experience in. When he came back to Russia after his European adventures, Peter decided he needed to modernize Russia. He revamped their army and created a table of ranks, which allowed for government positions based off of merit rather than family and noble relations. One of the biggest problems for Russia at this point in time was that they didn't have any warm water ports. They had tried to defeat the Ottomans for control of the Black Sea, but were unsuccessful. They were able to gain control of ports along the Black Sea from Sweden, though. In that area, they will build a new capital, which of course, like any great leader, Peter will name after himself. St. Petersburg will be known as the new gateway to the West. The city of St. Petersburg sits on where a swamp used to be. Peter had workers drain the swamp, and that's where he put his city. St. Petersburg was created to model Western European cities at the time, and you can see that he took a lot of influence from the French and the Dutch during his travels to influence the architecture he had put in St. Petersburg. These are two images of Peter the Great that depict other changes he made. The left picture is him portrayed as a benevolent ruler who brings Russia into the light. The right image is a picture of him cutting off a man's beard. One thing Peter really pushed was that to modernize, they needed to modernize in everything, even clothing and hairstyles. Traditional Russian clothes were usually long tunic-like shirts that came all the way down to the ankles, with pants worn underneath. The Russians also usually had very long beards, which, when Peter was abroad, he noticed that Europeans were all clean-shaven. So Peter passed what was known as the beard tax, where he said any man with a beard must pay a special tax, and they would get a signed letter saying they'd paid their tax for the year that they had to carry with them. So of course, people didn't want to pay more taxes, so most of them just cut their beards off. But if a guard caught you without your certificate, the last ruler we will talk about is Catherine the Great. Side note, the Russians are pretty loose with the term the Great, so just imagine how terrible Ivan really had to have been. Just saying. Anyways, Catherine was the wife of Peter III, who became the Tsar. She and many others in the Russian government did not like her husband's conservative ruling style, and while he was away on a vacation, they took over the government, and Catherine was placed as the tsarina. She is Russia's longest reigning female monarch. Catherine herself was actually from Prussia and was used to more Western modern ways. She will embrace many of Peter the Great's ideas about Westernization, but she has a very flip-floppy way of doing it. Like, for example, she valued education and set up a lot of schools, and even specific schools for girls, but she also made it possible for the boyars not to pay any taxes, and basically the country got all of its wealth from the serfs. Catherine also had some military success. She was able to beat the Ottomans and take that section of the Black Sea that Peter the Great was unable to win, and she is even able to conquer as far west as Poland to extend the Russian Empire. Initially, Catherine was very open to reform, and she would invite Western philosophers to Moscow and surround herself with forward-thinking people. She made great advancements in art and literature for Russia, and she did allow some regions more self-governance. But after several serf rebellions that happened because they were fed up with paying so much in taxes, and after Catherine watched the French Revolution happen, she became much more oppressive. The revolution really scared her. I mean, they literally cut off the heads of the entire French royal family, and then total chaos ensues for the next 10 years. So her advancements basically stop after this point in time, and there really aren't any rulers after her that try to reform Russia on that scale. The backwardness of Russia is one of the big reasons the peasants will rise up in the early 1900s and start the Bolshevik Revolution. Russian absolutism created social and political tensions that lasted into the 20th century, and they would never be able to modernize to the extent of the West. World War I really shows the Russian people how behind they are and how much they need to change, which prompts them to move towards socialism and communism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This concludes our episode on the rise of the Russian Empire. Thanks for watching!